Okay, well, once again, welcome to each and every one of you. My name is Dr. Michael Lovett-Collier. I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Mission and Ministry. And along with Dr. Jeff Burns, Mission and Ministry is one of the co-sponsors of this series that we've titled Catholic Perspectives on Racism and White Supremacy. I recognize a lot of the names and faces on the call. You've been with us for previous sessions, so thank you very much for coming back. For anybody who might be new, welcome. Very glad to have us all together today for this wonderful conversation, this opportunity to be with such an impressive scholar and person, Dr. Pratt. So thank you for joining us today, each and every one. Just a few quick organizing points. I encourage you all to view today's event on speaker mode. That will allow you to focus most on Dr. Pratt and the slides that she'll be sharing. You'll be muted throughout. I ask you to keep yourself muted so that we're not distracted in any way. And if possible, I ask you to consider turning off your camera. That helps preserve the bandwidth and make the experience better for everybody. Dr. Pratt will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then after that, there'll be opportunities for questions and answers that we'll manage through the chat box. I think that's all I needed to say. Again, welcome. I want to turn it over now to Dr. Jeffrey Burns, one of the other co-sponsors of the event.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Jeffrey Burns of the Harps Center for Catholic Thought and Culture. As Michael said, we're co-sponsoring this event. I also would like to welcome Dr. Pratt. We're very pleased to have her with us in this series. It's my pleasure, though, to introduce the person who will introduce Dr. Pratt. So I'm going to introduce the wonderful Dr. Maureen Day. Dr. Day is a professor at the Franciscan School of Theology here at the University of San Diego. And she is the author of a wonderful new study called Catholic Activism Today, published by New York University Press. She's involved in many, many other research projects and is quite a devoted young scholar. So Maureen, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Jeff. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Tia Noelle Pratt. As you heard Michael briefly say that she's not only a great scholar, but a great person. I am fortunate enough to be able to speak to both parts of that identity of her. Tia and I, whether we are serving together on a panel or whether we are being served a cocktail after a session, we have had lots of wonderful conversations where I've seen Tia artfully weave her sociological insights in with her theological insights, all animated by a great hope and devotion to the Catholic Church and seeing what tomorrow can bring. So I'm just really pleased to tell you that she's not only here as an academic, but also here as a Catholic, and going to be bringing that sort of hope to her talk today. But to tell you a little bit about her accomplishments, Tia Noelle Pratt, Ph.D., is a higher education professional, researcher, and inclusion and diversity specialist based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She received her PhD from Fordham University in 2010. A sociologist of religion by training, Dr. Pratt is an expert in systemic racism with 20 years of experience researching and writing about systemic racism in the Catholic Church and how racism impacts African-American Catholic identity. For 2018 to 19, she was the inaugural scholar in residence at the Aquinas Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She has done consulting for the USCCB's Secretariat for Cultural Diversity in the Church. She is also the president and director of research at T.N. Pratt and Associates, LLC, a research and consulting firm providing a variety of resources and services to aid clients in developing strategic solutions to meet their inclusion and diversity needs. Dr. Pratt's research examines the intersection of race and religion and the ways systemic racism impacts the experience of religion. Dr. Pratt studies the Roman Catholic Church as an institution, providing needed sociological analysis of race and religion. She is a contributor to the edited volumes American Parishes, Remaking Local Catholicism, and Young Adult American Catholics, Explaining Vocation in Their Own Words. Dr. Pratt is currently working on her first book, Faithful and Devoted: Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. This research is supported by funding from the Louisville Institute and the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Dr. Pratt is an active public scholar. She is a member of the first cohort of Sacred Rights, a Luce Foundation funded program hosted by the Northeastern University that supports scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. She's written for Faithfully, America, and Commonweal, and regularly gives lectures for a wide audience. She's given public lectures for the American Catholic Historical Society, Villanova University, the Diocesan Financial Managers Conference, and the Diocese of Camden, among others. Dr. Pratt is the curator of the BlackCatholics Syllabus, a collection of resources related to Black Catholics in the United States that prioritizes the work of Blacks in order to center the voice of Black Catholics in the creation of their own narrative. Finally, Dr. Pratt is also active in several professional organizations, including the American Sociological Association, the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, the American Catholic Historical Association, and the Association for the Sociology of Religion. And so it's with great gratitude for what she's done and what she continues to do that I hand the floor over to Dr. Tia Pratt for her presentation today. Thank you, Tia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for having me today. I'm very glad to be with you all. And thank you for taking the time to join us. I will begin by sharing my screen so that you can see the slides. Let's see. And is that, I'm going to assume that everybody can see the slides. Yes?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So today, the title of my talk is The Call is Coming from Inside the House, How the Catholic Church Can Become Anti-Racist. And as Dr. Day said in the introduction, I'm the president and director of research at TN Pratt & Associates, and I am on Twitter at Tia Ph.D. I'd be very happy to connect with you on Twitter if you're also on that platform. So let's get started. So today, the focus of our session and what I will talk about today, I'm going to start with my approach to these issues and then talk about systemic racism, anti-racism, my research, my specific research in this area, and the Black Catholics Syllabus, which Dr. Day mentioned in her introduction. So this very kind face belongs to Father Brian Massengale. And Father Massengale is a faculty member in the theology department at Fordham University. And in 2017, Father Massengale gave a keynote address at the Ignatian Family Teach-In, where he talked about issues of systemic racism and racial justice in the church, and talked about how it's okay to be uncomfortable as we talk about these issues, and that we have to embrace that feeling as we have adult conversations about race. And it's important to be ready to be uncomfortable, to allow ourselves to be in that space, and that we're also okay with making others uncomfortable. But Father Massengale can say it a lot better than I can. So here's a clip of him, and the first couple of seconds, there's no sound, so don't worry about that.
Truly. And it's one of the things I was most looking forward to. I do a lot of speaking and talking about the issues that are going to face us, but it's actually joy to be with you. And we're going to do some really heavy stuff in the next 30 minutes. Because talking about racial justice in light of the Magis isn't easy. Turn to someone next to you and say, it ain't gonna be easy. It's not gonna be easy, because if it were easy, we would all be not only talking about this, but we'd be well on our way to having a more just world. It ain't gonna be easy. So tonight, we're gonna do something that we usually don't do. We're going to have an honest, adult conversation about race. We're going to have an honest adult conversation about race, and when we have honest adult conversations about race, people may feel uncomfortable or embarrassed or ashamed or fearful or angry or overwhelmed or helpless or paralyzed. And if you feel any of those things in the next half hour, that makes you normal. Feel the emotion, because there are few issues that grip us and affect us emotionally than the issue of race. So feel the emotion, acknowledge it, but don't allow it to check you out. Feel it, and then come back in. So you've been forewarned that we're going to have an honest, adult conversation about things that matter. And I believe that you can handle it. I believe that you can handle it.
Well, I have embraced what Father Massengale points out here, and the need to really feel that emotion and really to feel uncomfortable and be comfortable making others uncomfortable, because it's really the only way that we can do this work. And the other side of the approach that I take to doing this work comes from sociologist Dr. Joe Fegan. And Dr. Fegan describes racism as being foundational and systemic. He talks about how racism pervades all of society's core institutions, our systems, our social systems, and that's why we talk about racism as being systemic, whether those institutions are the economy or education or politics or religion or the family. I mean, just think about the conversations that we're having around Senator Harris being the first African-American and the first Asian-American vice presidential nominee on a major party ticket. This is the fact that we're still having these conversations and using that language tells us just how deeply embedded these issues are in our society. But Dr. Fegan goes on to talk about racism as being oppressive and exploitative, that is designed to exploit land and labor for material and social benefit of those who control society's core institutions and the hierarchies that lie therein. And it's not enough. It's just not enough to not be someone who engages in mano-a-mano or personal racism, that level of racism that involves using racial slurs or painting racist graffiti on somebody's door or something like that. Because if we don't move into higher levels of thinking and understanding about racism, if we stay stuck on the personal racism level, what that does is it allows folks who don't engage in those specific behaviors to tell themselves and everyone else that none of this has anything to do with them, when in fact it does. It absolutely does. So we must think about the ways that our systems are designed to oppress some while benefiting others. And to that end, we need to move our thinking beyond the race relations model, which our society has been stuck at for far too long, that mano-a-mano personal racism model. Well, I didn't do that, and I didn't own slaves, and I didn't beat people up, and I didn't do this or that, so none of this has anything to do with me. But when we move beyond that to a racial justice model, then we start to think about our systems. When we start to think about our organizations and how racism is embedded into the fabric of our society through our institutions. But even that's not enough, because we have to move from even that level of thinking to an anti-racism thinking. And an anti-racism thinking allows us to start to break down those systems where racism is so deeply embedded and rebuild our systems, rebuild our institutions in such a way that they are not racist. They are in fact anti-racist. And when we talk about doing the work with capital letters of breaking down racist systems in our society, that's what we're talking about. And anti-racism really has three phases. The calling out of the racism, the making people feel uncomfortable, the feeling of being uncomfortable. The second part is really white folks realizing that they're racist, or at least not as progressive as they thought they were, or finally admitting that systems are racist and are designed to work in their favor. And part of that is acknowledging that white supremacy is more than the Klan and other armed violent organizations. Because all those organizations do is terrorize Black people and other marginalized people in our society, terrorize to the point that folks don't engage and don't want to fight for their rights because it is too dangerous. And so we must resist that and realize that that armed wing of white supremacy makes all the other factions possible. That it's not just this one small element, that it's part of a bigger issue. And so the third phase is doing the work of dismantling these racist systems in order to build systems that are anti-racist. So I only do parts 1 and 3. And this lovely GIF was created for me by a former student. And I once said, yes, I'm here to smash systemic racism, like Wonder Woman breaking the glass. And 10 minutes later, she sent this to me. And it is a pleasure to be able to include that as I give these talks. But I really only do parts 1 and 3, because part 2 really is the work that white folks have to do on their own and with one another. And I can't be the one to be the one Black friend, essentially. I can't do it. And because it's not really my role. My role is to call it out. My role is to build the new structures. The part that comes in the middle, that's not my piece, because Black and brown and Asian and Native folks, we didn't build these systems. So it's not up to us to come to that realization, because we had that realization for hundreds of years now. So this summer, we've seen a lot. We've seen a global pandemic that we're still in the midst of. Where I am here in Pennsylvania, the state Secretary of Health said just yesterday that we are moving into the fall surge of coronavirus cases. So, this is not over. And, this summer we also saw George Floyd murdered in the street in that gruesome 9-minute video that sparked a global reckoning, a long overdue global reckoning around these issues. And the church is not immune to this. It is not immune at all. And it's not immune because the call is coming from inside the house, because none of this is happening in places far away. If we don't look in the mirror, if we don't look at the ways that these things are impacting the institutions in which we live our lives, because we live our lives in institutions. And as a sociologist, that is something that I have truly spent my entire adult life thinking about, writing about, talking about. And we have to understand the ways that these issues of systemic racism pervade, not just something that's happening over there, some city or some state far away, or some organization that we know very little about. It's happening where we live. And we have to embrace that and do the work, or else we're going to be right back here having these same talks again. So from here, I'll talk about some ways that systemic racism in the church has impacted my own work. So in order to do that, we have to start with the numbers. And according to the Census Bureau, according to numbers that were released last year, there are 43 million Blacks in the US. And these are people who identify as one race. As we know, since 2000, we can check as many boxes as we wish for the race question on the census form. But this is really about folks who only check one box. And today is the last day to fill out the census, and which can be done online. So if you haven't already, you still have time to fill out your census. But because the census doesn't ask questions about religion, we have to turn to other sources in order to get that information. And so CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University, tells us that there are 72.4 million self-identified Catholics in the United States, or 22.1% of the US population. And the self-identified Catholics, these are people who do just that. This is not about partaking in the sacraments. This is not about being registered in a parish or attending or frequency of attending Mass. This is just folks who will check a box. And we all know that Catholics have a very strong fallen away group, folks that will check a box when called on to, but haven't been to Mass in 20 years and will fight you if you try and tell them that they're not Catholic. So when it comes to issues of race, we need to turn to the USCCB, and the USCCB tells us that there are 3 million Black Catholics in the US. So approximately 1% of the US population are Black Catholics, which means approximately 7% of Blacks are Catholic and approximately 4% of Catholics are Black. So while these percentages are for Black Catholics are fairly small, we're still talking about 3 million people. 3 million people isn't nobody. 3 million people merit a place in the discourse. But given those first two numbers that I gave you from the census and from CARA, the third number doesn't quite add up. The numbers don't add up. It's disproportionate. The number of Black Catholics in the United States is disproportionately small. And we have to look at why that is. And there's this perceived fundamental incompatibility between being Black and Catholic. But that perception doesn't exist for Black Catholics. Being both Black and Catholic cannot be incompatible for those who are in fact Black and Catholic. But those numbers really don't add up, especially if we look at parts of the country where we see fairly significant numbers of Black folks and fairly significant numbers of Catholic folks overlapping. Where we look at the two maps of the country and overlay those two maps, the numbers just don't add up, and we have to really look at why that is. And in doing that, that's how we focus on systemic racism. And this picture, of course, is of the great Nobel laureate, Toni Morrison. And this is actually a still from a TV interview that she gave where she had an exchange with the host about issues of race and racism. And she concluded the exchange by saying, if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And we need to confront the ways our church has put Black people on their knees. And in order to do that, we really need to confront in a very detailed and rich way the history of Black Catholics in the US and the ways systemic racism has been a part of this story for as long as there's been a story. And so, we start by looking at slavery, the most egregious form of systemic racism that we have, and the ways in which the church acquiesced and perpetuated the institution of slavery in this country. And we look at slavery, and the church, and the efforts by the church as a fledgling institution to fit in with its Protestant neighbors. And I always try to remember to point out that, the church in the United States wasn't always the massive institution that we understand it to be today. Major provider of social services, of healthcare, of education from pre-K through Ph.D. It wasn't always that at all. And as the church was trying to gain footholds in the United States, part of that included acquiescing and perpetuating racist norms. Dr. Shannon D. Williams, who's in the history department at Villanova University, in her work, she talks about the church being the largest corporate slaveholder in the United States. And in order to really start to embrace and confront these issues, we have to reckon with that and realize how all of this is still a part of how we experience Catholicism now. So even beyond that, active denying Black men and women access to the priesthood and religious life, which still has reverberations today. Denying Black Catholics access to the basics of Catholic life, like the sacraments and parish life, which will come up a little later in the talk and the specific example that I'd like to share with you. So these are issues that contribute to these numbers and this disproportionately low numbers that I talked about a minute ago. So, the consequences are still being felt. The minuscule number of African Americans we see in religious life and in the priesthood in the United States. The USCCB tells us that there are only 250 Black priests in the United States. In our parish life, in parts of the country where predominantly Black parishes are something that we find, which is not doesn't happen all across the country, but in parts of the country where we see that, it is Black parishes that bear a disproportionate burden when it comes time to close churches and reorganize parishes. And even here where I am in Philadelphia, every time a church closes, it is estimated that 30% of that church's members just fall away from Catholicism. They don't move on to either a nearby church or another church. And I just here in Philadelphia, I've been through this process and this very deeply painful process twice. And I have told our Archbishop directly, I cannot go through this again. I just can't. It's too much, especially in a culture where the parish is so deeply a part of Catholic life. And our universities, think about our Catholic universities. Other than Xavier University of Louisiana, which is the only Catholic HBCU, which is historically Black colleges and universities. So other than Xavier, when we look at our Catholic colleges and universities, where do we see how many Black students are there? How many Black faculty? How many Black administrators? What about board members? Leadership, not just student body, but also leadership positions from faculty to board level. That's important. That matters. And the fact that our universities don't have it is an issue. And it's an issue that needs to be confronted, and it has to be part of a strategy to break down the barriers of systemic racism that inhibit our church. And so our schools at our elementary and high school levels, we see this as well. You know, if a school or a school system, a Catholic school system, has rules about requiring that faculty are Catholic, if they're going to work there, or administrators are Catholic, but the numbers already are what we talked about a minute ago, then that limits your talent pool if you're trying to have a diverse and inclusive administration. You know, our chancery offices, you know, why is it that Black leadership in chancery offices begins and ends in the office of Black Catholics, if a chancery office even has an office of Black Catholics, because so many don't anymore. You know, so we have to not just think about this and talk about it in an abstract way. Oh, you know, systemic racism is something we see and we have to do something about it. No, we have to look at the places where it happens and then create strategies in order to dismantle it. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about anti-racism. So, you know, I want to kind of take a breather right here and, you know, ask and just kind of reflect right now. We won't pause for questions right now, but really just kind of reflect and, you know, in what ways do, you know, we need to break down the structures of systemic racism in our Catholic institutions. Let's kind of take a pause and really think about the institutions that we're affiliated with, whether it's where we work, where we worship, where we fellowship. Our Catholic institutions, and looking around the table and saying who's not there, that matters, and that's important as we talk about this and start to create these strategies. So, as Dr. Day said in her introduction, I'm working on my first book. I'm currently writing the last content chapter, and it's called Faithful and Devoted, Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. And it's a mixed methods and, you know, historical analysis, some participant observations, some interviews, and it pushes back against this lingering idea that being Black and Catholic are not compatible, or even that there are no Black Catholics. Some of you might be surprised, hopefully you're surprised at how often I get that question or that reaction. Oh, I didn't even know there were Black Catholics. Or that what few Black Catholics there are trace their origins to conversions that took place after World War II. And that's just not true. It's just not true at all. And kind of, I call that, you know, the exotic, and at least what I call the exoticism of Black Catholics. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. And I wrote about this in the Faithfully article that Dr. Day mentioned. And there is a historian who wrote about, he tells this anecdote in the early part of his work, talking about these two sisters who arrived in Chicago from New Orleans to join their father, who had already moved there. And they arrived on a Sunday, and the first thing they wanted to do was go to Mass. And he just goes on and on and on about how wonderful it is that these two sisters are comfortable attending Latin Mass. Yet the story that he relates happens in 1938, you know, decades before vernacular Mass came to Catholicism. So Catholics anywhere around the world in the 1930s had better have been comfortable attending Latin Mass. And so when I talk about the exoticism of Black Catholics, I talk about white scholars in particular who take something that is perfectly beautiful and wonderful because it is ordinary and gives it this air of the extraordinary or the exotic, and turns Black Catholics into some kind of exotic kind of novelty, rather than Black Catholics being a long-standing part of the church, not just in the United States, but globally. As I said in the Faithfully article, at the time St. Patrick was casting snakes out of Ireland, Black folks were practicing Catholicism. So this is not new. What's new is white scholars knowing that it exists. So in the book, I talk about how systemic racism in the church resulted in the small number of African-American Catholics, that this racism continues to impact African-American Catholics' experience through church closings and parish reorganizations, and an identity that develops from it, particularly through liturgy. Through liturgy as a form of identity work is what I focus on, is an act of resistance to the church's systemic racism. And another key issue that I talk about that I want to share with you in some detail today are issues of race, space, and place. And in order to talk about that, we need to talk about the two key ways Black parishes came into being. Parishes that were specifically created as such, like St. Peter Claver in Philadelphia, which I'm going to talk about in some detail in a minute, and parishes that developed through neighborhood changes over time and the collapse of the national parish model. So, like I said, I wanted to spend some time with you today talking about St. Peter Claver. So this is the southwest corner of 12th and Lombard in South Philadelphia, also known as St. Peter Claver. And you may notice that it doesn't necessarily look like a Catholic church. It doesn't have a grand stone facade that we might think about Catholic churches as having. And that's because it wasn't built to be one. Before it became St. Peter Claver, it was the Fourth Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. The story of St. Peter Claver begins officially in 1886, when Black Catholics, particularly in South Philadelphia, but really throughout the city, came together under the name of Peter Claver Union. And the parish was founded before they had a church, which is often the case in that time period and through the early parts of the 20th century. And St. Peter Claver was the first Catholic church in Philadelphia designated for Black Catholics. And Black Catholics had been pushed out of other churches in Philadelphia, particularly in South Philadelphia, due to things like segregated communion lines, pew fees, being charged just to go to mass, being banned from parishes outright. Just being banned from parishes outright is something that the members of Peter Claver Union experienced. And for them, and for so many Black Catholics in this time period, church on Sunday didn't provide a respite. Our brothers and sisters in the historically Black church denominations and the denominations of the historically Black church, they had a respite. They were able to go to church on Sunday and have Black ministers leading the service and having taken part in leadership in the church. And Black Catholics just didn't have that. Sunday was just another day for all of the same racism. And so that's why having their own church mattered so much. And at the time, this location at 12th and Lombard was a prime location. The neighborhood was transitioning. It was becoming heavily African-American. And an early example of white flight, the members of Fourth Presbyterian had moved across the Schuylkill River into West Philly, and the church followed them, leaving that building at the corner of 12th and Lombard vacant and available for sale. In this history of St. Peter Claver, written for its 75th anniversary, it gives credit to St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Ghost Fathers, Archbishop Ryan, who was Archbishop of Philadelphia at the time, Patrick Quinn, who was an executive at Beneficial Bank, which was founded by St. John Neumann, the fourth Bishop of Philadelphia, but only gives passing reference to the Black parishioners who raised through entrepreneurship and modest means the 80% of the funds to buy Fourth Presbyterian from the Presbyterian community. And they didn't get credit for that. They didn't get credit for St. Catherine Drexel got credit, Pastor Quinn got credit, the Holy Ghost Fathers got credit for their contribution, Archbishop Ryan claimed credit, even though the diocese gave no financial contribution to the purchase of this church. But the Black Catholics, who did so much of this labor to make not just their parish, but their church possible, only got a passing reference to their loyalty and sacrifice. But what they did get was protective language in the deed that said that Peter Claver would always be used for the benefit of Black Catholics in Philadelphia. But this erasure of the contribution of those founding Christians of St. Peter Claver, this is what happens when someone else writes our stories. And this is why it's so important, why, we say representation matters. If we're not writing our own stories, then erasure of our contributions is the result. It just always is the result. And regarding the founding of St. Peter Claver, Anne, who's a second generation parishioner, said in an interview with me, St. Peter Claver was bought by Black Catholics. They raised the money to get this church. It wasn't the Archdiocese or anybody else. The history of Black Catholics always said, and they gathered them up talking about some priest or nun as if Black people were sheep and there was no brain, or only one person had the brain, and that person wasn't Black. They had to be led and gathered and directed all the time. And when we tell our own stories, this erasure that Anne references doesn't happen. But by the 1980s, the neighborhood of St. Peter Claver was changing it. And this photo that I have here really kind of articulates how that change was happening. You'll see in the background here that this is a parking garage. It's a very large parking garage that runs the length of the city block, exactly a block and a half away from St. Peter Claver. And it's about 40 years old at this point, and looks its age, but it was really a marvel when it was built in the 80s. You have this parking garage at the top, and you have retail space, a supermarket, and a drugstore on the ground level. And so you have all of this parking in a neighborhood that is notorious for having very little parking. And so it's difficult to say, and beyond the scope of what I'm doing, to say whether or not this parking garage was a result of the gentrification that was happening in the 80s, or it initiated that gentrification. But the two are very much connected. And so with this gentrification kind of blossoming and the neighborhood changing, the diocese starts to think about what's next for Peter Claver. And a report is commissioned, a report that's known as the Sites and Boundaries Report. And the Sites and Boundaries Report is released in April of 1984. And it recommends keeping St. Peter Claver open because the parish is financially viable. It's within the urban renewal area of Washington Square West in that section of Philadelphia. And the report says that the parish has real symbolic significance for the Black Catholics of Philadelphia, and that Blacks might feel abandoned if the church is closed, and specifically says that the issue of protective language may lead to unpleasant complications. Well, that was the recommendation to Cardinal Kroll, who was the Archbishop of Philadelphia by then. But nevertheless, the parish is suppressed in May of 1985. And that suppression triggers a long court fight. It triggers a long court fight in civil court that finally ends in Philadelphia Orphans Court, which had jurisdiction over the matter in 2017. So this is going from 1985 to 2017. where the protective language is interpreted as to allow for the sale of the Peter Claver property, which is not just the church, it's the church, the adjacent rectory, and the school next door. So it's a very large property in a section of Philadelphia that is in great demand for redevelopment. In fact, there are some townhomes directly across the street that when they were built, each one sold for more than $1 million. So this property is poised to sell for millions of dollars. It's a neighborhood that's ripe for development. And so the Orphans Court said that, you know, the property could be sold, but an appeal was filed by the Friends and Descendants of St. Peter Claver, which is a organized group of parishioners and folks who are concerned about the history of St. Peter Claver and what has happened over these years, and maintaining that protective language, maintaining Peter Claver's role to benefit Black Catholics in Philadelphia. And so the story of St. Peter Claver isn't over. You know, it looks like it might be when the Orphans Court decision came down, but now the case has moved into canonical court. And at this point, it's unclear if the Vatican will ultimately make a ruling on the matter. That part hasn't been decided yet. As somebody who is researching and writing about Peter Claver, you know, you want to be able to tell the end. You want to be able to tell how all of this ended. But as a member of the community, as someone who is deeply concerned about the history and the legacy of St. Peter Claver, you know, it means a lot to me that it's not over yet. So we still have to see what will happen to St. Peter Claver. But what happens now is we have to think about, you know, the loss of our churches, the loss of our sacred spaces, how that impacts racial minorities, the poor, those who are already marginalized. And an institution cannot continue to marginalize people and expect those people to be active in the institution. It just doesn't work. And when I mentioned earlier about 30% of Philadelphia Catholics just kind of falling away when their churches close, I mean, that's how that happens. That's one example of that point. So what happens now is, you know, we must keep up the fight for justice. We must actively resist the racism that plagues our church. And that means getting into trouble. I get into trouble a lot. What John Lewis called, what the late John Lewis called, you know, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. I thought about wearing my good trouble t-shirt today, but I thought that might be a little too on the nose. And it also means getting into trouble the way my dear friend, Sister Cora Marie Billings, who I think is on the call, taught me how to get in trouble. And yeah, I get in trouble a lot. It's okay. You know, people get mad at me. But that's what we have to do, because that's what it means to engage in this fight and to do the work of justice, and to do that work for me, not just as an academic who writes and talks to other academics, but also is engaged in what is happening in the community. And that is very important to me, because otherwise the academic work just kind of sits on the shelf and it doesn't do what it needs to do. It doesn't do what I needed to do. And the reason I got into this in the first place was to do academic work that made a difference, that helped move the needle to where it needs to go. And that is only towards justice. You know, this, yes, is this my 2-minute warning?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So, and I see this work really as the modern day overturning of the money changers tables, because that's the radical piece. That's the Jesus piece. That's the Jesus that I follow. That is the Jesus who inspires me to do this work. And so how do I do that? You know, I do that through my research. I do that through my writing. I do that through talks such as this. You know, I also do it through the BlackCatholics Syllabus, as was mentioned earlier. You know, the syllabus can be found on my website on tiapratt.com. It was launched this summer back in June. You know, this period of history we are all living in, because we're living in it. We're not living through it. We're living in it. It calls us each to concrete action. And the syllabus was something that I felt that I could do. And it is a collection of resources related to Black Catholics in the United States. It's intended for academics, journalists, educators, institutions, parishes, congregations of women and men religious, the general public, in short, everyone. And it prioritizes the work of Black Catholics in order to center the voice of Black Catholics in the creation of our own narrative. Because if we're not creating our own narrative, then that's when the erasure happens, as I mentioned before in talking about St. Peter Claver. And so before we turn to questions, I would just invite us all to kind of pause for a minute to perhaps think about, you know, what do I know now that I didn't know before? And then maybe we can have a few questions and continue our conversation. So with that, I will stop sharing screen so that I can see you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pratt, for a great presentation. We'll now ask people, if you would like to ask a question, please submit the question through chat. Then I will call on you and you can ask your question directly to Dr. Pratt. So please use the chat feature. So Dr. Pratt, I have a question about St. Peter Claver.
Yes.
In Oakland, a number of the Black parishes become very attractive to white parishioners.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the case at St. Peter Claver?
So St. Peter Claver, there haven't been any activities at all at St. Peter Claver since 2014. Oh. The parish, as I said, was suppressed in 1985. There were a couple of years after that, in 87, it was turned into an evangelization center, and there were periodic masses there for a while, but all activity ceased in 2014. So right now it's really an empty building. There are other parishes, other predominantly Black parishes in Philadelphia that for a number of reasons have become attractive to white Catholics. There's a parish in the Germantown section of the city that I'm thinking about that has been known for years for its outreach to the LGBTQ community, that has been known for its social justice ministries, and for that reason has become kind of like a last stop for folks who are more progressive in their thinking and their views in the church, and maybe a kind of a last stop to those folks who might otherwise have one foot out the door.
Great. Okay, we have a question from Mark. So Mark, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question to Dr. Pratt. Well, I'll ask his question for him. He says, please expand on Shannon D. Williams' statement that the Catholic Church is the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas.
So, you know, I certainly don't want to speak for Dr. Williams. And I would, invite you to look at her work for some detail. But I will say, when she talks about that, she's talking about, religious communities that own slaves, thinking about the Jesuits and the Vincenzans and the Supplicans, dioceses, bishops. So, the ways in which slaveholding and slave labor really helped to build the infrastructure of the church in the United States. But as I said, for detailed information, and certainly Dr. Williams' work speaks for itself, I invite you to.
Sorry about that. Okay.
Did you get that whole my whole statement on that?
The last sentence got cut off.
Oh, the last sentence got cut off. I think the last sentence was just an invitation to look at Dr. Williams' work more closely,
Okay.
because our work certainly speaks for itself.
Okay, we have a question from Joyce Jones, who asks, did Philadelphia just start a personal parish or territorial parish for African Americans? Was that related to the closing of St. Peter Claver?
No. So Philadelphia doesn't have the territorial parishes became predominantly Black parishes over time as the surrounding neighborhood changed. St. Peter Claver was founded under the old national parish model, which is related to, but is distinct from the personal parish model that we see now. Dr. Tricia Bruce has a book on personal parishes. So Peter Claver was founded really as a national parish, but a national parish for Black folks in Philadelphia. So while it did have boundaries, really any Black Catholic in Philadelphia could go to Peter Claver. And in fact, anybody could go to Peter Claver, really. It wasn't, exclusively for Blacks, but it was founded for Blacks because of all of that very painful history that I mentioned in the beginning.
Okay. We have a question from Joanne Holly. We'll try this one more time to see if she can unmute herself. Joanne, would you try to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay. I am also potentially in a very noisy environment as I am outside. But my question very quickly was, how did affirmative action impact Blacks in university settings, either in numbers of students or better representation amongst the faculty or governing boards?
Well, if we look at our faculty at our Catholic higher ed institutions, we look at our faculty, if we look at our administration, we look at our boards, we know that there is little to no African American leadership. So, affirmative action really doesn't play in that sense. In terms of student body, when you look at the student body numbers, the last numbers I looked at for the institution where I used to teach, even though the institution sits in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Philadelphia, less than 4% of the student body was Black. And only about 13% of the total student body was minority of any kind. So, the idea that affirmative action is going to fix it or did fix it, I mean, the numbers just aren't there.
Okay, thank you. Michael, do you want to follow up with that question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pratt, for a wonderful presentation. In particular, what I was wondering was, what would you recommend as most important strategies for a Catholic university like USD moving in the direction of becoming anti-racist?
So, the strategy that I recommend a lot is it can't just be one aspect. You can't say, oh, okay, well, so we're going to increase the student, the number of Black students by this much, because if you don't have Black faculty to teach them, if you don't have a curriculum that they can relate to, if you don't have leadership that's representative, then you're going to bring in X amount of Black students for a freshman class. And then by the time the class gets to junior year, that number is going to be cut in half. When that happens, it's not the students, it's the institution. And so there has to be a holistic, what I call the orchestra method of doing this. And I use the orchestra as the metaphor because in an orchestra you got the strings and the percussion and you've got all of these different instruments within each section, and they're each doing their own thing, but together they're doing the work of creating the beautiful music of the orchestra. And the work of becoming anti-racist, it has to happen not just in the student body. It has to happen in the student body. It has to happen in faculty. It has to happen in other employment in the institution, in the employment that is, decision making and at the board level. So it has to happen everywhere, and it has to happen really at once in all of these different areas in order for it to really work. To have, oh, we're going to have this, we're going to have a talk. Yeah, we're going to have a talk and it's going to be great. And yay, we fixed racism. No, we didn't. The talk is just what the talk does. Really, what the talk does is it reinforces what's happening structurally. And it lets everybody who is within the structure know this is the direction we're going in. But if all you're doing is having talks, then you're not doing anything.
Thank you. Stephanie, can you unmute yourself with the question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
So my question, I realized that many Catholic dioceses or institutions aren't all embracing the language of anti-racism yet, and they're opting instead for things like racial healing or racial reconciliation to describe initiatives of how they're responding to the current moment. And I'm just wondering, based on your analysis or your experience, like, what will it actually take for the church to really embrace anti-racism in and of itself?
Oh, that's a good question. To embrace what it's going to take. What it's going to take is to have people who are about the work, who are about the language, who are about saying this is what we're doing, and embracing the modern day money changer, turning over the money changer table aspect of the work is going to take those people being at the table with the local ordinary or the institution president to say, this is what has to happen and it has to happen now. Otherwise, it's just, pie in the sky fluff talk. And frankly, I'm not here for it. I'm too busy. I've got too much to do. I got too much trouble to make.
Thank you. Maureen Day, please.
Hello, Dr. Pratt. Thanks so much for your talk. And I realized how close I touted you and talked about how hope was such an animating piece of it. But then coming through in this talk, the connection of hope to justice for each other was so vivid for me. So my question kind of builds off of Dr. Levitt-Collier's question that was asked earlier about the university, but instead of the university turning to parishes and the diocesan level, maybe I obviously working in concert, like that was a theme, but what are some of the steps that you would say individual Catholics or parishes or dioceses might take in this to become more anti-racist?
So over the last few months, I've had pastors contact me about this. And one pastor in particular he felt the need and he felt called to address these issues from the pulpit on Sunday. But he also felt that he was not himself informed enough to be able to talk about this as eloquently as he thought that he should. And I encouraged him to embrace the fact that he was learning, to embrace the fact that he saw this as necessary, and to communicate to his parishioners how necessary this is, and that he himself was still learning, but that didn't change the fact that it was important, because if our pastors especially wait until they become experts, then it's going to be another 30 years. We don't have that long. We frankly just don't have that long. We barely have 30 days. Now, every day we've got to be pushing this and doing the work. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. So at the parish level, what I would say is, one, don't think that just because your parish is not a predominantly Black parish that you don't have to talk about these things. I mean, everybody needs to be talking about these things. They just may need to talk about them for different reasons. So there's that, and I would say to pastors especially, don't be afraid to educate yourself. Don't be afraid to admit that you're still learning, and invite your parishioners to do that work with you. Hire consultants. I mean, this is what I do for a living these days. I consult with parishes and with institutions who are looking to do this work. And, if we're to make a big C Catholic church that is small C Catholic, because we don't have that in this country.
Thank you. I'd like to go to Sebastian's iPad. Sebastian, can you unmute yourself? Okay, well, Sebastian's question is, what do you think about our current way of doing theology, being a contributor in perpetuating racism in our church? And how to turn around to theologize in a manner that constructs anti-racist narratives? Stories shape our actions.
Okay, so first up, I'm not a theologian. I am a sociologist, and I can, speak at length about the issues within sociology as a discipline, and while theology very much informs my work, I'm not a theologian. That being said, there is room for anti-racism work in all disciplines. And, the first step to that is one, having scholars who are going to do the work, not marginalizing scholars who do the work. I mean, the reason that, when I first got out of graduate school, and when I was still in graduate school and I was trying to publish my work, nobody wanted to hear about it. Nobody wanted to hear about Black Catholics. Nobody wanted to hear about racism in the church. And I got told, this doesn't make sense. Nobody understands what you do. I mean, I really did. I got told so many times, nobody understands what you do. And my response to that was, you got a Ph.D. You can't read a book. You can't learn. But anyway, so nevertheless, I've told people, and I think I even, Maureen, I think I even told you that, this summer I felt like I was screaming at a brick wall for 20 years. And that this summer, it's like how in the movies that, you press on a wall and it reveals a secret door. I feel like that's what's happened this summer. And on the other side of the secret door were all of these people that just came kind of flooding out over me and basically were saying, oh yeah, we heard you the whole time. We just didn't care until now. But okay, fine. Now you care. Well, now you're going to hear it. Now I have all of this, bandwidth to speak the things that I've been saying for a long time. So, how you go on social media and it's like, listen to Black women, cite Black women, because Black women been telling y'all for years before you started listening. Well, here we are.
Thank you. Is Dr. Richard Miller still with us? If you are, would you please unmute?
I am, yes, thank you. Hello, Dr. Pratt.
Hello, Dr. Miller.
Did I say Dr. Pratt? Golly day. Dr. Pratt. I'm at the University of San Diego, and like most Catholic institutions of higher education, we're trying to diversify our student body and our faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And with so few Black Catholics out there, that's what the demographics show. We're trying to recruit African-American students who are not necessarily Catholic. Mm-hmm. Is it your opinion that non-Catholic African-American students see the Catholic Church as racist?
Well, I think that would depend on what their experience of Catholicism is up to the point before they get to the university. If their experience is robust, like there are, at my former institution, there were plenty of African-American students who were not Catholic, but had been educated in Catholic schools before arriving at the university. So they were well-versed in Catholic education. But, it's really, the best way to not have Black students perceive Catholic institutions as being racist is for Catholic institutions to not be racist. That's the best way to really make it happen. Although I will say that at my former institution, I taught a course, Sociology of African American Catholicism, and there was a young lady in the course who wasn't Catholic, but she had always been educated in Catholic schools, and she very much said that the values she learned in Catholic schools had become her values. But from the things that we talked about in the course, had she known them when she was applying for colleges, she would not have come to that university. That being said, I taught at a Jesuit university, and the middle part of the course was about Jesuit slaveholding, which was really a revelation for a lot of students. But it has been my experience that students who are not Catholic, while they may or may not have a call to explore or discern whether or not Catholicism is for them, the values of the institution are values that they very much embrace, otherwise they wouldn't be there. Whether it's Jesuit values of cura personalis, or finding God in all things, or other values that we find in our Catholic institutions. But it also has been my experience, and my research has shown that when you start talking about issues of race and racism with Black students in Catholic higher ed, yeah, it's there. It's absolutely there. And what happens is they sometimes think that what they have experienced is in isolation. But when they start to realize the full specter of what has happened and what is happening just on their campus, then that's when things start to happen.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that if we focus in our recruitment on the values, the humanistic values, that's really what we need to focus on to try to attract non-Catholic African American students to a Catholic institution. There are some common values. Yes.
But you also need to get Black folks on your board. You need to have Black deans. You need to do a cluster hire and hire like 10 Black folks across the gamut of your institution and all sorts of different departments at one time. Because just hiring 1 or 2 Black folks a year is not going to do it, because those 1 or 2 Black folks, as I'm sure you know, Dr. Miller, the weight of all of it is just too much. But if you do a cluster hire, research has shown that if you do a cluster hire, then it's a lot easier, one, for the needle to move in the institution, and the people that come in have an easier experience.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is Brenda of Sacramento still with us? If Brenda of Sacramento is still with us, please unmute. Okay, well, among other things, she wanted to give her regards to Sister Cora. Let's go for we're going to have one last question. Well, Brenda Burns, are you there? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm here, and thank you very much. Tia, it's nice to see you on the screen. And my concern is, I know we are having seminars now initiated by a priest from another parish in our diocese. I'm in the Wilmington Diocese. And we've had 2 sessions on Brian Massengale's book of racism in the Catholic Church. And listening to us tell our story about how we've had to deal with racism in our church, I have many, but I'm not going to go into those. My concern is how we dismantle it. And as you said earlier, it's not our job. We didn't do this. And we need to get the leadership of the diocese to co-sign our efforts and recognize that there is active racism in the church. We have even had some Caucasians come to our church, which is a Black church, because they were shunned in another church. And the bishop had begun to work on trying to make our diocese churches more friendly, but that got sidetracked by some other issues.
Mhm.
And one thing that I think is critical, especially in our Catholic schools, is teaching Black Catholic history.
Absolutely.
Are not newcomers to this church. We were there from the very beginning, and that story needs to be told.
Mhm.
So how can I do, or we do, one, getting Black Catholic education into our schools? We're having a hard enough time getting it into the public schools, Black Catholic, Black
Mhm.
history,
Mhm.
but, and also get a buy-on from our bishop and the leadership in the diocese as to how we can do this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So I will say that, you know, the listening session format, that happens a lot, is what happens is, you know, dioceses tend to get stuck there. You know, you have a listening session, people feel heard, and then nothing happens for like 2 years. And so then when it's time to start again, then you go back to the listening session. And so when you just have the listening session over and over again, then you never move to the next level of thinking. So you're stuck at that race relations model that I talked about earlier of folks' personal experiences. And that matters. I mean, that has its place, because if nothing else, the Black folks in the room hear that other folks have experienced what they've experienced, and that what they've experienced isn't happening in a vacuum. But
my problem is, because of my age, I've been going through this since the 60s. It
Sure.
has waxed and waned and waxed and waned. And I agree, enough.
Enough. And, you know, this summer I was part of some meetings with Archbishop Perez here in Philly. And I said, we've got to move to the next level. We cannot be stuck at this level. So that means we've got to start looking at structural issues. We've got to start looking at curriculum in our schools. We've got to start looking at hiring. As I said earlier, you know, Black leadership cannot begin and end in the office of Black Catholics. There's got to be more than that. And to say, oh, we want to hire Black folks, we just can't find any. That means you're not looking. If you look, you will find folks. And if you look and you don't find folks, and you need to look harder, you need to look differently, then you need to contact Black Catholic leaders and scholars and consultants such as myself, who will help you strategize and do this work, because it can be done. And if you prioritize it, if you have the will to prioritize it. You know, I understand for individual schools that, you know, it can be difficult with curriculum if you're dealing with, you know, especially if you're a diocesan school. But those things can be mitigated. They can be managed. That's why board leadership is important. If you're a diocesan school with a board, and you have a board that has prioritized this, then the school leaders can tell the board, we need you to go downtown and help us wage this fight. We need you to make arguments at a level that we can't. I mean, that's why I said everybody, that's why the orchestra method is important.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time for questions, but Dr. Pratt, do you have a final statement you would like to make?
Oh, a final statement. A final statement. I will say, I'll say this. I'll say this as a final statement, because it's something that has really been on my heart today. This morning, I attended the funeral of my great aunt, of my grandfather's only sibling, and her death has hit me in ways I didn't expect, because I very much saw her as an anchor of Catholicism in our family. because of just my lived experience as a Black Catholic and the research I do, I spend every day of my adult life thinking about how hard it is to be a Black Catholic. And the witness of my Aunt Janet made that a little easier. And now she's gone. And other anchors in my family are gone now too. And I feel the weight of their loss. I feel the weight to become that anchor in my family as I get older. But that also, encourages me to keep going, especially on days when it's tough, like today. And to be here with you and to share my work is something that makes it a little bit easier moving forward. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. We're very sorry for your loss, and we'll keep your family in our prayer. But we thank you for your time. And my one takeaway is we've got a lot of work to do. So thank you very much for laying it out and encouraging us to pursue that work. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Michael Lovett-Collier to take us home.
Yes, Dr. Pratt, my sympathies as well for you and your family and your loss of your
Thank you.
Aunt Janet. I was going to say we're so grateful for your time, but then learning about the funeral earlier today, even more so. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your passion, your eloquence, for the ways that you had of taking complicated, difficult subjects and making them accessible. So thank you for your wonderful presentation and questions today. We're very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be with you.
And then for everyone else on the call, I invite you to come back again next Thursday, same time, 12:30 to 2. Our next presentation in this series will be given by Pedro Rios, who's the program director in the San Diego American Friends Service Committee. And he'll be giving a talk called Federal Enforcement Parameters that should bridge border communities and the movement for Black lives. So please join us. It'll be great. I've seen Pedro talk before. He's absolutely outstanding. It'll be another great series, another event in this series, just like the one we had today. So thank you all for being with us today. If you'd like to join us next week, you can register at sandiego.edu/CCTC. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.